You can easily drop $1,000 plus on your first gaming PC and build something very capable, but what if you're on a pretty tight budget and you only have a Benjamin and some change to work with? I'm here to let you know that you've got some options, and today we're going to explore one of these. While building something that plays games well and checks all the boxes can be challenging in this budget range, with $100 or so, it's not impossible to pick something up that you'll get at least a solid foundation for a decent gaming PC. It's not going to come close to the gaming performance of, say, a console, but you can argue that there's a lot more utility and it gives you a good starting point. Today I want to take a look at this. This is a computer that I got from a local seller that was taking down a computer lab, so they had about 20 of these systems for sale. This system came with some pretty basic components that I'm sure did well for its job. The case is a simple M-ATX Antec model. The motherboard is a lower end Asus B450 Prime. For the power supply, it's a Corsair CX 430 watt unit. And then for the RAM, it's a 2x8GB kit of Corsair Vengeance DDR4 that's clocked at 3200 megatransfers and has CL16 timings. For the processor and GPU, this computer actually came with a chip that's called an APU. This is basically a CPU and a GPU combined into one single chip. Specifically, it has a Ryzen 3 3200G. This chip is a 4-core, 4-thread CPU based on the Zen Plus architecture. And as for the GPU, it's rocking Radeon Vega 8 graphics. That's 8 total Vega GPU cores. So the computer came with everything to get up and running, except for an SSD. I paid $100 for the system, and then I added this 500GB T-Force SATA SSD that I had on hand to complete the system. The SSD is currently going for about $28 on Amazon, so to boot, the system in total cost me just under $130. With these specs and this cost, this is a solid little office PC with some potential to play games. The 5-year-old 4-core, 4-thread CPU and Vega GPU that can only utilize a max of 2GB of VRAM are going to struggle in modern games. But the gaming performance of the system is not necessarily what draws me to the build. What excites me about the system is its potential. The system comes with all that's needed to make upgrades in the future. The B450 motherboard can support newer Ryzen CPUs, including X3D chips for massive CPU performance gains. Then on top of that, the system includes a standard ATX power supply with a PCIe power connector, which opens up a lot of options for adding a dedicated GPU. Good news is, though, it can definitely still play some games. I just don't want to set your expectations too high. With that, let's test this system out and see how it runs. Getting into the testing, I want to mention that you can overclock the GPU if you have an A or X series motherboard. So those are like B550, B450, X570 motherboards. So in doing that, you can get a little bit more performance out of this APU with some tuning. First, jumping into Black Ops 6 Zombies on the lowest possible settings and 100% resolution scale at 1080p, the FPS hovered around 20 FPS. So not a great experience, not playable in my opinion, even though I did end up passing round 4. At 720p, again at the lowest settings possible and at 100% resolution scale, the average sat at about 33 FPS. It felt very choppy, especially with the very low 1% lows, and it looked worse than I remember Xbox 360 Zombies looking. Again, I did pass an early round of Zombies, but the performance was pretty off-putting to me, to be honest. In Assassin's Creed Valhalla, at 1080p low settings in the built-in benchmark, I saw an average of 22 FPS with a 1% low of 19. At 720p, the average was 34 FPS with a 1% low of 24. So potentially, you might be okay with that. Personally, I don't think it'd be super enjoyable for me. For Mean Greens, the performance was about the same for both 1080p and 720p. I didn't mess around with it too much to kind of figure out why, but it averaged just below 40 FPS with 1% lows around 20. This is a multiplayer game, so I'd usually prefer a little closer to 60 FPS, and there was some latency that you can't really see, but it was still playable for the most part in my opinion, and I think playing with some friends I'd be okay with this. I don't know why I even tested Final Fantasy 16, but it was absolutely unplayable. Even with FSR enabled at 720p, it was a slideshow with an average of 13 FPS. So, if this is the game you want to play, you're going to need something else. Compared to the other games tested so far, Tomb Raider 2013 runs great on this system, and it looks pretty good in my opinion also. At 1080p normal settings, the average sits around 60 FPS, and then testing at 720p, that jumped up to above 120 for the most part. Testing the finals, in the practice range, it didn't feel too terrible to be honest. At 1080p low settings using the TAAU upscaling, it sat around 44 FPS average, and then at 720p the average was just under 60 FPS. Unfortunately, in real games the performance dropped to more like the 30s and 40s respectively, and then there was some pretty bad latency that made it a poor experience. In Overwatch 2 at 1080p low settings, the average held just above 60 FPS, with 1% lows that dipped into the 30s. The latency might take a little getting used to, but if you're coming from, say, a Switch, this is going to feel a lot better. At 720p low settings, the average was in the 80s with 1% lows in the 50s, although it did drop down to the 30s a few times. Lastly, I tested Fortnite, and it was a lot of fun honestly. I tested the game in 1080p performance mode with everything set to low, and saw an average that was in the 70s and 80s, with 1% lows in the high 30s to 50s. I don't know if it was kind of the expectations set by some of the other games that I tested, but honestly this felt pretty smooth for me, especially for Fortnite. At 720p, the average FPS was above 100, with 1% lows in the 50s. I honestly forgot I was testing for a little bit and was rolling some bots. I got to top 3 with 9 kills, and then this happened. Even with that glitch, if all I wanted was to play Fortnite, I think this PC would keep me satisfied for at least a couple of months while I was saving up for more upgrades. And again, comparing this to, say, something like a Nintendo Switch, the performance you're getting here is a lot better than what you can see on a Nintendo Switch. So if that's what you're upgrading from, it'll feel like a little bit of an upgrade at least. So that does it for the benchmarks. While this computer can run some games, and I'll add I had a good time playing them, if you're wanting a gaming PC, you're likely going to want more power and more performance than this can provide. That is unless you're okay with 30 FPS at 720p at best, outside of older games and very optimized esports games. In my opinion, this is a great system and solid value. It still allows you to have some fun and easier to run games, while hopefully holding you over while you're saving for an upgrade. Speaking of upgrades, go ahead and leave your suggestions for how you would upgrade this PC down in the comments below, and then follow along because I'm going to be upgrading this in a future video. Thanks for watching. Goodbye.